So if anybody's wondering, he's like, gee, where's Dr. Steve? Dr. Steve is in Japan. You know, the only drawback to having world-class talent is sometimes the world wants them back. So it is, it's a great day to be here. It's the fourth week in our series on forgiving, which is one of those things we identified that we as a church needed. And I can tell you, you know, for me personally, you know, I would say that all of us as individuals probably need, you know, a little further sharpening of those forgiving skills, or, you know, even just the basic, you know, it's like, how do I do that? That's really hard. You know, everybody tells you got to forgive, but how do you do it? So we've been going through that, and we've been talking about forgiving using the book of forgiving, well titled, by Desmond and Mfo Tutu, based on the work that they did with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And where we are at today is in taking a look at the other side of the coin. How do we ask for forgiveness? And, you know, maybe even most importantly, how do we forgive ourselves? In my preparation for doing these talks, one of the things that I routinely do is I spend a lot of time in meditation. I'll, you know, read and do some research, and then I'll meditate for a while, and I'll read and do some research and meditate for a while. And as I was doing my final meditation on this talk, it came to me how integrally forgiveness is tied to change. And it reminded me of, and particularly when we talk about both asking for forgiveness and forgiving ourselves. And it reminded me of one of my favorite cartoons about change. And Barry, if you'll bring that one up, I'd appreciate it. So this happens in church a lot, right? Everybody wants change, but when you say who wants to change, you get a lot of sheepish looks and the hands go down. Right? Thanks, Barry. When it comes to asking for forgiveness, right, what that implies, I think at a very foundational level, is that in some way I'm willing to change. And if I'm not willing to change something, whether it's my attitude about whatever it is, or the way that I live, or what I'm doing, if I'm not really willing to change, I know in my heart I'm not deserving of forgiveness. And it just becomes an empty exercise in my. Right? Paying lip service, which is not what real forgiveness is about. And that's something that they really focused on in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. One of the things that they did, and in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they were offering a real incentive. The people that came forward to ask for forgiveness, to unload themselves of their crimes, in many cases, they were granted amnesty. And one of the choices that they made in setting this whole thing up was not to require the people to display remorse. Because what they did not want people to do was falsely saying, oh yes, I'm very sorry, I'm awful sorry. What they found was that the vast majority of people who came forward didn't just say their crime to get off the hook and leave. They actually did express remorse. And there were tremendous things that happened in the course of those proceedings, and some amazing forgiveness that was granted. But one of the key pieces that they've identified in this process for us is that if we're going to go and ask someone's forgiveness, we need to genuinely feel remorse. And genuine remorse leads to change, because fundamentally it's a change of heart, isn't it? You know, we change our minds, but we have to change in here. Now, one of the biggest things that keeps us from doing that, aside from, you know, our habits, right? Many of us, myself included, are creatures of habit. Most of mine used to be bad. I'm trying to change that up. I pray, I meditate, I run a lot. Did my first 10K yesterday. Wasn't an official one. We were just running and running and running and running and running. Yeah, exactly. Run, Forrest. Yeah, that probably should be my new nickname. But when we decide we're going to change, we have to be willing to accept the consequences. And, sometimes those consequences are very small. It's simply the eating of a little crow, the growing of a little bit of humility. Sometimes the changes are very large. In the rooms of recovery, we like to say, you only have to change one thing. Everything. Right? And that's what it takes. But there are people who have been willing to make some pretty scary changes. So, Barry, if you'd bring TJ's picture up. There you go. This guy, TJ Layden, he was a neo-Nazi starting at the age of 14. And he got a lot out of that gang sort of environment that he wasn't getting at home. Got older, enlisted in the Army, began recruiting neo-Nazis from within the armed services, got out of the Army, came back to the block, got more deeply into the organization. It became really central to who he was. And he described going out and doing some very unpleasant things to people. He said at first it bothered him a little, but eventually it just became part of who he was. And he was really making a life out of it. He met a nice neo-Nazi girl, got married, and they started having little neo-Nazis. I'm not making this up. And one of the little neo-Nazis was about 3 years old. And they were watching a program on TV, and I believe the subject was like the Caribbean, the West Indies, something like that. And there were some people of color on screen. And his 3-year-old changes the channel and proudly says to, Daddy and maybe Mom, if she was there, that he did it because we don't watch the N-word. Except the 3-year-old actually said the N-word. That finally woke him up. And I'm going to actually read a little bit from his story. I'm not reading the entire thing. But I want to read you a little bit of his reaction to that because I think it bears hearing in his own words. He said, "At first I felt proud that he was turning into a racist like me." Can you imagine? But then I started thinking, if I wasn't raised to be a racist, and I'd turned out the way that I was, then how much worse would my children, how much worse would my children be? And then it hit me, if I didn't want my sons to grow up to be like me, there must be something fundamentally wrong with the whole premise and purpose of my life. Slowly I began to think beyond the black and white rhetoric of my group. I began to imagine what might happen if the whole world was white. Would we then be saying, well, we've got to get rid of all the non-racist pagans, or everyone with a genetic defect is next to go? Finally, it got to a point where I had to choose which path of life I was going to take. So, it's interesting. The first thing that he did was he went to his mom's house and he apologized to her. And what she suggested that he do was contact the Simon Wiesenthal Center and apologize to them. So he did. And he got in touch with them and explained who he was and said, I have some things I'd like to give you. And apparently he became the first neo-Nazi to actually bring evidence out of that movement. And he said that the experience of grace that he got from that was just really difficult to believe. At first, his first contact with them, the first rabbi he talked to was a little iffy on even talking to him, but he eventually got the guy to kind of believe that he was sincere in what he wanted to do. And after he had turned some stuff over. He then offered to speak. And he said that probably the most grace he'd ever felt in his life was when a Holocaust survivor came up to him and said, "I forgive you." He, is still speaking about his experiences. And he's in danger. I mean, he's being targeted by the neo-Nazi movement. But that was the level of change that he was willing to go to in order to ask for forgiveness. And that was the amount of change he was willing to initiate in his life to receive it and to deserve it. So when we want forgiveness from someone, what are some of the things that we do? Well, just like a couple of weeks ago I talked about when we were going to forgive somebody, sometimes it helps to maybe practice on somebody neutral first before you confront that person that harmed you, right? To tell your story. When you go to ask forgiveness for somebody, it might also be helpful to go to a friend, somebody that you trust first, and practice how you're going to ask it. Because again, that's one of those things where emotion may get in the way the first few times those words come out of your mouth. And, whether it's a friend or a counselor or a member of the clergy, find somebody that's willing to help you. You're probably not going to find the perfect words to get it started, so just dive in. When you go to actually ask for forgiveness, just start. And don't have any expectations. My first sponsor used to always tell me an expectation is a premeditated resentment. And what we do not want to do is create yet another resentment in our relationship with that person. It took me a long time to realize that Jay was talking about my expectations of me. But that's another talk for another day. When we ask for forgiveness, what we're doing is essentially playing the other side of that fourfold path. And Barry, if you could bring that slide up now. So those of you who've been here the last couple of weeks, if you remember, and if you're new here, what we're talking about here is how we stop doing the revenge cycle and we go up and do the fourfold path of forgiveness. And it begins with, being hurt, having some kind of harm done to us, or losing something, and then feeling the pain of that. And instead of choosing to harm somebody back in return, we're going to choose to heal. And it begins with telling the story. So if we have harmed somebody else, what we've got to be willing to do first is what? Let them tell the story. We got to be willing to listen to the story, right? And we have to be willing to listen as they name their hurt. We've got to let them tell us, okay? And it may be difficult, right? And they may want to ask us questions. We need to answer those questions honestly. We need to be willing to sit on the other side of this whole cycle. Some of the things that may happen are, we may kind of feel a little put out, like, gee, what I did was not that bad. Or, I don't understand why she was upset to begin with. Okay? We cannot get into judging their feelings. You remember I used the example of a child who was, hurt because their mother did not cut the crusts off of their bread. Or, like their peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It's not up to mom to say, that's not important, your feelings don't matter. If mom wants to be forgiven for that, we have to treat that hurt as valid and important, because it is valid and important to that child, who may have had that, been holding that hurt until they were 35, right? Now, most of us at the age of 35 probably realize crusts on peanut butter and jelly sandwich are not a big deal, right? But they were when we were 5. So we don't get to judge other people's feelings. We don't get to judge other people's hurts. We just have to say, you know what? I was I was I was wrong. One of those really difficult things to say. In fact, I think we should all practice saying that together. Together, I was wrong. Now say it like it doesn't hurt to say it. Together, I was wrong. Okay? I was wrong. It doesn't hurt that much to say it. So, it's not up to us to argue with the folks. It's not up to us to cross-examine them. It's not up to us to make them defend why they feel the way they feel. If we want to be forgiven, we're there simply to listen to them, tell their story, answer their questions, they name their hurts, and then we allow them to decide whether or not they're going to forgive us. And this is a real key. Just because we ask for forgiveness does not mean we have the right to it. Okay? Just because we're being all nice and we're being all humble and we're saying, yeah, I'm willing to do whatever it takes, doesn't mean they owe us. We are coming into a culture where everybody feels entitled to something. We're not entitled to forgiveness from someone we've harmed. It's nice if they're willing to grant it. And, sometimes, just like in life when, you pray for something or whatever and, you expect a yes or no answer, but the answer is actually wait. Sometimes when we ask for forgiveness from someone, they're not done with their process. And we need to allow them to get through their process. And so, the answer that we're going to get is, wait. I'm not ready yet. That's okay. Whatever that answer is, we need to continue on with our side of the process. We got to continue cleaning up our side of the street. And that's one thing I learned in 12-step as I was doing the work that we are called to do. It's on us to clean our side of the street. What happens on that other side is not my responsibility, but what happens on this side, it absolutely is my responsibility. Right? So if there's any restitution to be made, whether or not I have a promise of being forgiven, I need to make restitution. Right? And restitution is not always giving back the same thing that was taken away. There's sometimes we just can't do that. When a person has died. I told that story, I think it was last week, about the woman who decided to make a living amends for the 2 girls that she killed when she was drunk and driving. And her amends was to go out and tell her story in prisons and schools and, wherever she could do some good. Even if we don't get forgiven, we still make things right because it's the right thing to do. So we do the things that are ours to do, and then we allow that person both to decide whether or not they're going to be able to forgive us, and then whether or not they want to release or renew the relationship. We have to let them do that. That's not up to us. That's for them to decide. And if they decide to release the relationship, we need to accept that decision with grace and humility. Because that's simply what we owe them. So, there are times when we are going to have to learn how to forgive ourselves and things for which we will have to forgive ourselves. And Barry, if you could give me the next slide. I want to actually read some of this story because it's one of those stories that you just think, man, I don't know how someone lives with that. In 1985, Penny Bernstein, and this is Penny, was brutally beaten and sexually assaulted in a state park in Wisconsin. Soon afterwards, Stephen Avery was convicted of the crime. 18 years later, however, advances in DNA testing realized that he'd been innocent all along. Penny writes, a couple of years after the attack, I remember saying to my therapist that although I felt my assailant needed to be in prison, I was struggling with the knowledge that he'd left 5 children behind. She didn't understand this. Like most people, her attitude was, you should have wanted to kill him. Cleaning that up a little. It happened in a beautiful place. I was out jogging when a man grabbed me from behind and pushed me into a wooded area. She goes on and describes the attack. She says, my last thoughts were, I wish I'd kissed my son goodbye this morning, and my daughter's last vision of me will be of my dead, beaten body. 2 good Samaritans found me. In the emergency room in the hospital, I gave a description of him to the police. I asked the sheriff if he had a suspect in mind, and he said yes. I found out later that this was Stephen Avery, who was out on bail for sticking a rifle in the face of a deputy sheriff's wife. Later, they put 9 photos by my bedside. I presumed the suspect was among them. Steve's photo was in there, and I selected it. That night, he was arrested and held without bail. The live lineup, I looked at 8 men and again picked out Steve Avery. I'd selected his photo, and his image had become enmeshed with my memory of the real assailant. In my mind, he was the only person. As it turned out, my actual assailant was not in either the photos or the lineup. Bottom line was he was found guilty and given a 32-year sentence. She said that after the assault, I went into a deep depression. I felt that I disrupted the lives of my husband and children, and I shut down emotionally. Then one day, I read about a young woman 10 years younger than me who had gone out jogging and been murdered. And she realized she'd been given a second chance on life. So she went and trained to be a mediator in the restorative justice system. But then in 2001, so this is 16 years later, Steve's attorney contacted the Wisconsin Innocence Project, who agreed to help with his case. A year later, there was a motion to release additional biological materials for DNA testing. 2 hairs were tested, one that was identified as mine. The other one belonged to someone else. That someone was not Steve Avery. In the CDDIS database, they got a direct hit with a man named Gregory Allen, who in 1995 had brutally raped a woman in the Green Bay, Wisconsin area and was subsequently serving a 60-year sentence. Gregory Allen looks very much like Steve Avery. When my attorney told me the judge had reversed the verdict, I wanted the earth to swallow me. After all, I was partly responsible for identifying the wrong man, and no one can give Steve back those lost years. Not a day goes by when I don't think about the woman Gregory Allen raped in 1995, which was 10 years after her incident, or wonder how many other women's lives were drastically altered in those years when he was walking free. I sunk into another deep depression and, feeling utterly powerless, wrote Steve a heartfelt apology letter. In it, I stated that I felt like an offender and offered to meet with him. So she meets him, and when it was time to conclude the meeting, I stood up and went over to Steve and said, "Is it all right if I give you a hug?" He didn't answer, but just grabbed me in a big bear hug. Then "Steve, I'm so sorry." And he said, "Don't worry, Penny, it's over." That was the most grace-filled thing that has ever been said to me. Because, of course, it isn't over for him. I was totally overwhelmed. He didn't use the word forgiveness, but I think his generosity of spirit has allowed me to start moving forward. When Steve and I met, it occurred to me that our handshake was the first physical contact we'd ever had, yet our lives had been intertwined for 2 decades. Since the exoneration, it sometimes feels I'm living in some parallel universe where the usual rules no longer apply. I'm still struggling. The most difficult thing in all this has been being able to forgive myself. And yet, she's still doing the work. She's doing the work that needs to be done. And sometimes in order to forgive ourselves, we need to go out and ask for forgiveness from someone else. we do some really awful things to ourselves, but I think the things that we beat ourselves up the most for are those things that involve other human beings. And as difficult as it may be, and I can't imagine meeting someone that I had unjustly had imprisoned for, 18 years. I can imagine that. To be able to say I was wrong and have them forgive me would be unimaginable grace. When we are unable to forgive ourselves, it affects every area of our lives. It affects us in the same way as not being able to forgive other people. It's a stressor both emotionally and physically. And one of the biggest things that it does is it keeps us stuck, and it keeps us from growing. It inhibits our ability to change. If we cannot forgive, and if we cannot accept forgiveness, we cannot grow, and we will not change. If there is anything that we are here on our soul's journey to do, it is to in some way expand our consciousness, in some way grow, and in some way change. And it doesn't matter whether we're walking the path of forgiveness from the side of the person doing the forgiving, or from the side of the person seeking forgiveness, or from both sides simultaneously. At the end, we must tell the story of what has happened and allow that story to unfold without our ego's objection. At the end, we must name the hurts and allow our hearts to open themselves, be vulnerable, and shut our mind down and say, no judging. We must forgive or be forgiven or accept that forgiveness is not possible this time. And finally, we must be willing to renew or release a relationship, and we must be willing to be the person who is released at times. When we do this, we actually have the chance to change, and we have the chance to grow, and we have the chance to live a life that in many cases we may not have known was possible. This work may be some of the most important work that we ever do, and it is absolutely part of a life of spirit and a life well lived. I wish this work for every one of you. And I support you in doing this work going forward, as I hope you will support me and forgive me where I've needed.